So, I'm happy to welcome you at my channel devoted to housing market, real estate, and today we're going to talk about the size of housing, which is one of the most important characteristics of its quality, of the quality of living conditions. So we are used, I think, already to the decades of growing housing size, and indeed the floor area per person square meters or number of rooms per person increased a lot since 1950s, 1960s, as we can see here in these pictures. So we see that, for example, this is the floor area per person, and these are European countries. Green line corresponds to Germany, and we see that between 1950 and 2020s, the average floor area per person increased from, say, 15 to 30, 35 square meters, so more than doubled. Similarly, the number of rooms per person increased too. So it used to be 0.7, 0.75, and then it went up in the end of the sample to 1.5. And this indicator is especially interesting and important because it's used to measure crowding. So according to current standards, if you have less than one room per person, you are living in crowded conditions. So this means that more than one, so several persons have to share the same room. That was the case in 1950s. That's not the case, at least on average, anymore. Because now you have more than one room per person. Okay, so we've got a huge improvement in terms of housing size. Now, why did it happen? The first reason that housing stock grows faster than the population. Here we have data for Germany and data for France. The green line corresponds to the index of change in the number of dwellings, so size of housing stock. So I set it to 100% in 1961. And the black line corresponds to the change or to the evolution of the population size. So I simply calculated the number of people in 1961, in 2020, in the intermediate years, and then I computed an index. So what we see is that while population increased over the past 60 years by less than 20%, the number of dwellings more than doubled. Same thing happened also in France. Here we have some slightly different time horizons, but this doesn't affect the main conclusions. We have a rapid increase in the number of dwellings, which by far more exceeds the population size increase. So purely mathematically, if you have more and more dwellings, and this number of dwellings increases more rapidly than the population, you're going to have more square meters per person. An additional factor is that the newly built housing size was increasing too. So each year, the average size of the newly built housing was becoming bigger and bigger compared to the previous years. You can see it here. I showed here 6 different countries, more countries to show that it wouldn't improve the visibility. Plus, for these countries, we have longer time period, longer time. What is common for all of these countries is that we have an upward trend. It's not straight, it's not smooth. You have some fluctuations here. We'll talk about reasons for these fluctuations, but that's an upward trend. So in case of Belgium, we're at the average newly built housing size, which was 150 or less than 150 square meters around 1965. And by 1999, it attained 2 square meters. Same thing in Germany, from 70 square meters to 120. Same thing in Denmark, from 90 square meters to 150. Same thing for Ireland, for Japan, and for Russia. So we have the number of dwellings that is increasing rapidly, and we have the dwellings, newly built dwellings whose size is also increasing. All this, of course, together leads to larger housing sizes per capita, per dwelling, and then per capita. And it also reflects after some time, especially if housing construction is very intense, it reflects also in the average figures for housing stock. And that's what we observed in the previous slides. Now, at some point, something happened. The trend reversed. The timing of this reversal is different. In some countries like Belgium and Japan, it took place in 1999. In other countries like Denmark and Ireland, it took place after the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. But what is common to all these countries is that they changed the upward trend to downward trend. To some extent, the timing of this change can depend also on the measure we use to judge about the size of housing construction. There are at least 3 different measures: housing or building permits. So when you get permission from the municipality to build something, then after you got this permission, you can start building. And then after some time, if you were lucky, you complete dwelling and you can move in. Okay, so we have different indicators for different countries. For example, we have building permits data for Belgium, for Germany, and for Ireland. We have housing starts data for Japan, and we have housing completions for Germany, Denmark, and Russia. Of course, building permits are leading with respect to starts and completions, because it takes typically 1 or 2 years to build a house, and therefore it can be the case that higher size, which is a larger size of newly built dwellings, or reversal of trend, better to say, of the newly built dwellings, which took place in terms of building permits around 1999, has been materialized in terms of building completions, or housing completions 1 or 2 years later. So what led to these changes in the average newly built housing size? Well, one factor is the demography, and in particular, the shrinking household sizes. So here we have data on the average sizes of households. We see that 120 years ago, there used to be 5 persons on average per household. Now there are 2.5 persons. In some countries like Germany, even 2 persons per household. Why household sizes have been shrinking? One thing is that the fertility declines, so people have less children. Another reason is that there are more and more women that never had children. And the third reason is that more and more people tend to live alone. So there are more and more one-person households. That's what we can see here. That's the share of one-person households in the total number of households. And we see that in the early 900s, the proportion of these little households was less than 10%, and now it increased to 35%, in Germany even 40%, and in big cities 50% and more. So more than half of all households in big cities are one-person households. We observed that the average sizes of dwellings been increasing. At the same time, household sizes have been shrinking, so that in the end we got a mismatch between supply and demand for housing. So that's the distribution of households by size, by number of members, and of dwellings by size in Germany. So what we see here is that there are 40% and more of one-person households, 35% of two-person households, and less than 5% of big households with 5 persons and more. On the other hand, we have just the opposite, just the mirror image if we look at the distribution of dwellings. So there are very few, relatively very few small dwellings with one room, 10% of dwellings with 2 rooms, and 40% of big dwellings, 5 and more rooms. Which means that even if there's equality between the number of dwellings and households, so equality between supply and demand, you can still have a shortage of small dwellings because there's an excess demand for small dwellings here, which means that in this segment, prices will keep increasing, and this can lead investors to invest more and more in this sector. Now, what are these small dwellings? What kinds of buildings contain these small dwellings? So what we see here is the average size of dwellings by building type. Here we have single-family houses, here we have two-family houses, or detached, semi-detached houses, and here we have multi-family houses. So here practically that's the average size of the newly built flats or apartments, if you wish. The dashed line corresponds to West Germany. We have more data for past years for West Germany, while continuous line corresponds to unified Germany, to overall Germany. What we see immediately is that the average size of newly built single-family homes is much bigger than that of newly built flats. So it's 150 versus 70 square meters for flats. It's more than 2 times larger. In addition, we can notice that while the size of single-family houses keeps increasing, it started the size of flats started to decline after 2015, which of course contributes to the declining newly built housing sizes. Now, the proportion of flats in multi-family houses is not constant. It fluctuates. Actually, it fluctuates every 8 to 10 years. And the amplitude of fluctuations is quite big. So it varies from 30% to 60%. So from less than 1/3 of all dwellings being completed in a particular year to almost 2/3. And we see that there's a certain correlation, perhaps not very strong, but still some positive correlation with house price to rent ratio that is shown here in the lower panel. Now, what does house price to rent ratio show us? It's a kind of measure of housing booms and busts. So we know that there are at least two segments in the market. There is rental market and homeowner occupied market, and there are some fundamental factors determining the prices, for example, the demography, the income, the supply of housing. And rental price actually is pretty much tied to these fundamental factors. So when demand increases, rent increases too. When supply increases, the rent is expected to, at least, if not to decrease, to slow down. But in case of prices, we have a phenomenon of speculation, which is not present in case of rental dwellings. So we can buy dwelling in order to resell it at the future, at some point of time in the future, because we speculate that its price is going to increase. We cannot do it for dwellings. We cannot rent them now, and we rent them at a later stage because we expect the rent is going to increase. Well, we can do it, but that's not really reasonable. So when house housing prices start increasing, there's more and more speculative investment, which leads to decoupling of housing prices from fundamental factors, from rental price, and that is reflected in the rising housing price to rent ratio. That's what we see here, and these are also cycles that last for 8 to 10 years. And although, as I said, the correlation is not perfect, we still see the correspondence between housing price to rent ratio and share of dwellings in multifamily houses. So the higher the ratio, the larger the share of flats in total housing completions in a given year. Why does it happen? Well, because if land prices or dwelling prices are increasing, then you as investor, as a builder, are willing to build more dwellings on the same plot of land, because in this case you can more efficiently take advantage of increasing land prices, for example. So if you were planning to build a house with 5 dwellings on that plot of land, and if the price of this plot of land increased, then it's better, of course, to build 10 dwellings house instead of 5 dwelling house, because you can distribute the land price increases over a bigger number of dwellings. So when there's a boom, the proportion of apartments is increasing because you can squeeze more money, more profit from building larger houses with more dwellings. And until 2020, it has been like a cyclical movement. So house price rent ratio increases, share of dwellings in multifamily houses increases, but then it seems that there's no longer dependence between these two lines, because in 2021, in the end of 2021, interest rates in Europe were dramatically increased, and this led to fall in the demand for housing for sale. Therefore, the house prices decreased. Rents kept increasing at the same pace, so that house price to rent ratio declined. But we don't see any corresponding decline in the share of flats in the total housing completions. So perhaps we still have very few years here, but perhaps this is an evidence that we have some secular change here, some secular shift related to demographic change. Another interesting thing is that the size of multifamily houses has been increasing, and unfortunately we only have data starting in 1991. But we see here that, and this is the average number of dwellings per multifamily house, newly built multifamily house in West Germany, dashed line, and Germany, unified Germany, continuous line. So what we see is that starting in 2004, or between 2004 and 2024, the average size of newly built houses, multifamily houses, increased from 7 to 11 apartments per house, which means that we had over this period of time, we have bigger houses, multifamily houses. So on average, we have more dwellings per house. These dwellings are smaller, and the proportion of these flats in the total housing construction has been increasing. Now it exceeds 60%. So knowing that flats are smaller than single-family houses, it's no wonder that the average newly built housing size started to decline. So these are the factors that determined the decline in the average newly built housing size. Now, what can we conclude from all this? Well, the first thing is that the 20th century saw a revolution in living standards. Why revolution? Because the housing quality improved dramatically over the second half of the 20th century. At least we have reliable data for that period, unlike the first half of that century. So now we live in more comfortable and spacious homes than previous generations. And this is, of course, a clear improvement. But it appears that recently, or relatively recently, a saturation point has been reached. So we attained some maximum. In case of housing size, you can talk about lower bound and upper bound. So the lower bound is related to adequacy. So the housing should have some minimum size, otherwise it can be harmful for the health of people living there. So if you have, say, 5 or 2 square meters per person, then you live in crowded conditions. That's bad for your health. That fosters rise in infectious diseases. This affects your psychological health. So that, of course, it's better to increase the average size per capita. So that's what we've seen during the last 6 to 7 decades. The housing sizes were moving away from that lower bound to more adequate housing sizes. On the other hand, there's also an upper bound of sustainability, because when you build a house, when you live in it, when you maintain it, it uses natural resources, it produces emissions of CO2. So the bigger the housing, the more emissions, the more ecological harm it creates. Therefore, we cannot increase housing size ad infinitum, so there's some upper bound. In some countries, like Australia and the US, the average housing sizes are exceeding 150, 200 square meters, which is probably well beyond the upper bound of sustainability. So it's hard to imagine that the population of the whole world lives in such spacious homes. And what we observe, at least in Europe, that perhaps we reached some maximum, and now we are declining. It's difficult to say whether this maximum is above the upper bound or not. There's additional research is needed, but from the ecological point of view, it's actually a good development. What follows now is a decline in housing consumption. So until now, we observed it in the newly built housing sizes, and I predict that in the next years, we will see it also in the average sizes of the existing housing, in the housing stock. It's quite slow. This process is quite slow. Excuse me. This process is quite slow because housing construction is nowadays very weak, but it gains momentum. So we expect that year to come will bring up shrinking housing prices. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you next time.